Well, thank you to everyone, and as people are joining, and we'll jump in. And thank you, Katie, for your time today and for joining us to discuss your book, Curious Case of Mike Lynch.
Yeah.
Just quickly, as almost an aside, I love the cover, the little ones and zeros, the gold and shiny. It's a great cover.
I can't claim any responsibility for that, but Macmillan did a brilliant job.
Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah, so I mean, it's a fascinating story. It's brilliantly written, well done. I mean, it's a great book from start to finish. But it's obviously an incredible story. It's tragic. There's so much happening, and I guess, you know, I was trying to think this morning about where to start, and I guess, you know, I'd like to start. How did you come to this? Because when this was happening, I was kind of conscious of it, but I wasn't fully, you know, immersed in the story, I guess. So how did you come to it? And how did you approach writing such a big story?
It's a great question, and I did feel an enormous weight of responsibility while I was writing the book. It is a great story. It's also a very tragic story, and I was writing it just a few months in the aftermath, not only of Mike Lynch's death, but his daughters and others as well. But I came to this story before the tragedy. And I think for most people, for many readers of this book, their entry point, if you will, is the tragedy. That's perhaps where they heard about Mike Lynch, particularly people who aren't in the business world and maybe the British business world. But I was covering his criminal trial for the Times. I'm the technology business editor at the Times, and I was casting around and looking for a documentary to watch or a book to read about the last decade of his life, and beyond that, to understand how he had created his company Autonomy, and then after he sold it to Hewlett-Packard, he was accused of fraud, what happened next. And I just couldn't find anything comprehensive. There was a wealth of material from his side saying, I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything wrong. There was a huge amount from Hewlett-Packard saying, this guy defrauded us. We're going to take him down. And I wanted to understand the truth as a journalist and also unpick what I thought was a brilliant corporate thriller. So that was the genesis of the book. It was trying to look at that, the birth of Autonomy, the growth of Autonomy, its sale to HP, and what had happened with this alleged fraud. And I picked up the civil court judgment. So, which might sound like a boring starting point, but it read like a novel. Really, it was completely gripping. So Mike Lynch and his CFO, Sushavan Hussain, lost a court case in London in the High Court. They were sued by HP for fraud. And the judge wrote this mammoth, sort of more than 1,000 pages piece of work, which went through what happened within the business, cited extraordinary emails from Mike Lynch himself and his CFO, talked about the characters within his team. It was so big that it had its own dramatis personae. And so that's that.
I hadn't appreciated that. I mean, that's incredible.
Was what inspired the book. And I think, as you say, a lot of people have danced around the story, but it's so extraordinarily complicated that nobody had gone to unpick it. So I pitched a book then, which was, I think, about March 2024. Around the time of his criminal trial in California, he'd been extradited to the US after losing in the High Court here and was being held under house arrest with the head of his accounting department in Cambridge, a chap called Stephen Chamberlain. And then, as I'm sure everybody will know, he was acquitted, which was a real surprise to everyone, not least himself. And then he took this extraordinary series of holidays on his yacht, Bayesian. And very tragically, on the last day of one of those holidays, on the 19th of August, 2024, the boat was hit by a storm, toppled over in 15 seconds, and 7 people on board, including Mike Lynch and his daughter, drowned. So, sorry, that's a long-winded way of saying how. So there was almost 2 parts to how I got into the story. The first was the desire to tell the corporate story, but then after the tragedy, there was so much interest in the story, and I had a book proposal on the table. I also wanted then to unpick more about his life. And to your question about, what it was like writing the book. Yeah, I think it was always going to be a really painful story to write. He was a really divisive character. He was a Marmite character. He caused a lot of people a lot of pain along the way. And I've reflected a lot on that. And maybe that is common to other entrepreneurs as well. He had a ruthless streak. He could be a very difficult man. It was always going to be difficult interviewing people and getting people to talk. It was doubly difficult, to say the least, in the aftermath of his death. And I just felt such a weight to make sure that the book was balanced and that it got the story right. So it was a difficult period to be pulling it together.
Yeah, and he is such a fascinating character, his life, and just even the kind of initial, he's born without fingerprints, that in itself is like straight away, this is different, right? But he's born obviously to Irish parents in a very kind of lower socioeconomic setting. He's obviously very intelligent, and then he ends up, in the scholarship program in the private school in Cambridge, and he's even in Cambridge he's doing maths. And he's towards the top end, but those are almost 2 different worlds. So he's almost in conflict immediately, and being also this kind of hyper intelligent, he'd navigate his life constantly feeling like, oh my God, it's frustrated with the world almost.
I think that's a really good way of summing it up. I did feel that conflict throughout. One of the chapters is called The Outsider, and you've got a man who eventually became very much part of the British establishment, ostensibly at least. So he was on the board of the BBC. He was advising David Cameron's government on entrepreneurship. He was running a FTSE 100 business. They were sponsoring Tottenham Hotspur. In many ways, he was absolutely embedded into the establishment. But as you say, I think because of his upbringing, he was always aware of another world. And he stayed very close to his family, who were not in that establishment world through his entire life. And he had to fight every step of the way. So when I describe him as difficult, in many ways, you can understand why. And his achievements are extraordinary. And particularly in the very divided British society that we still live in, but the society that, was in the 70s and 80s, and he went to Cambridge in 1983. It is incredible.
And yeah, so just to take it back, so he goes through this scholarship and then he ends up in Cambridge, but there's a point as well in your book you highlight that he starts wearing suits and he wants to be, it's coming from him as well. There's this ambition for something, it's not just intelligence. It's not like a typical maths intelligence where somebody wants to be seen as, typically these high-end maths people, they want to be known as a high-end maths person. They don't want to be a business, or they're not concerned with suits. They're typically bedraggled, right? So that's there. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what really struck me very early on was the scale of his ambition. And as you say, the thought that he was never just a typical maths or science geek. He did quite well at university, but he came out with a 2-1. And it was unusual, actually, that he was encouraged to stay on and do a PhD. But what was really different about him is while his peers were hot-footing it to the city to make a lot of money in the aftermath of the Big Bang and those reforms, he decided he wanted to start his own company. He didn't think there was anything particularly useful, I think, about becoming an accountant or a lawyer. And it just shows the scale of his ambition. He wanted to start a business, and he wanted it to be a global business. And the company name that they first came up with when he was working out what to do and had a small office space in the St. John's Innovation Centre in Cambridge, which was like an early co-working space, was Cambridge Neurodynamics, right? And it was a deliberately vague, sort of clever sounding name, which basically allowed him and his co-founder, Richard Gaunt, to kind of do whatever. They was, I don't know how you describe it, so jack of all trades in the tech world. So people would come to them with a problem and be like, oh, we want to do this, you know, within our bank, can you help us create this piece of software? Or as he ended up doing, ironically, for a man with no fingerprints, you know, can you create a fingerprint reader?
Yeah.
And that neurodynamics umbrella allowed them to do that. But they also opened an office really early on in the US, which was just staffed by Mike's uncle. But I think very few techies can have a commercial understanding of what they're creating in the way that he did, but also go, okay, we're going to think beyond Britain. And so I think that was part of his genius, as it were, is he had this amazing entrepreneurial ambition and business understanding, which was way beyond his years, right? He was doing this in his early 20s. And certainly way beyond the way I think British people thought at that time, when entrepreneurship and certainly the venture capital industry were at a very early stage here compared to what was going on in the US.
Yeah, and I mean, we can talk about that later as well, that UK kind of tech dynamic and how he came into it. But, and I had in my notes, you know, I think at one point it's highlighted that he's, particularly in those earlier days, but maybe it's throughout, he's quite controlling, he's frustrating, he gets angry, you know, trying to achieve this goal. And I guess there's that, you know, is it because he's so ambitious, or is it just his nature, or is it a bit of both, or what do you think?
I think it's his ambition and frustration, perhaps, that not everybody was keeping up with that. I do think it was part of his nature. People who worked with him throughout his career, from the very early days in St. John's all the way through to the final days of Autonomy, and it comes through very strongly in the snippets of the emails that I put in the book, I think, as well. He would gaslight people. He worked on division. So even with his top team, he would change who his favorites were, whisper different things in their ears about other things people were saying about them. And he was manipulative and controlling. And that's how he ran the business, not only in the early days, but really strikingly throughout. And I think it was one of the problems for Autonomy, actually, is that it never lost that startup culture. He was really proud of it for many reasons, and there were lots of good things about it. He felt it could make them, you know, they could make very quick decisions. It had a small group of people in control, but also when you get to a certain size, that has problems as well. And perhaps, I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze him too much, but perhaps there could also be something about his upbringing and feeling like he was never going to be given anything on a plate. There was no silver spoon. He had to fight for everything. And so he just had a dogged determination and a real ruthless streak. You know, it was a dog eat dog world. And he was going to fight throughout. And you see that in the way that he took on Hewlett Packard after they accused him of fraud, you know, leading to like trials of more than a decade, which I think most people would have been crushed by that sort of legal tangle and weight. But he battled on, and that's how some people described him to me. He was like a bouncer. He looked like a bouncer, and he kind of acted like one.
Yeah. No, it definitely, you know, that's what comes out. It's just this constant, you know, baseline kind of battling. It's kind of like it's always
baseline
a
battling. Yeah, everything was a fight. And it's funny, you know, when you write a book, people tell you stuff afterwards that you wish they'd told you before. So because, you know, it was a divisive book to write, and I think people were wondering what side I'd come out on. Anyway, someone just rang me up yesterday and told me a story about how Autonomy tried to sell his company some software. They tried it out and then decided against it. And they described how Mike Lynch totally flipped from being the most charming, funny, engaging man to really, really angry sort of bull in a china shop screaming at them. And they say, look, shouting at us is not going to get us to buy your software. But I think anyone who was in the city or the tech world at that time knew about that reputation. Like he was notorious for it. Yeah.
And to be fair, it wasn't unique, in the city or in, many places. At that time, it's a fairly, some people would think you almost need to be like that. But in the earlier days, again, just going back to neurodynamics, there's this thing, and obviously you're the tech editor of the time, so you tell me, but that kind of there's a fake it till you make it element. But then there's also, that kind of where is the line, right? And I think there's one story you talked about where he made up a finance director to avoid creditors, which is, it's plucky, it's clever, and you hear these stories about many companies, but it's like, where is that line? What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is really difficult, and I think also we should clarify when we say fake it till you make it. The software was a real thing. They were selling a real product. So they weren't faking what they were doing. I think like so many entrepreneurs, they were faking the scale of it. So you talked about the finance director. My other favorite story from the early days is he had a sign on a cupboard door which said authorized personnel only. Right. So which made the office look far bigger than it was. And, if you didn't know, you'd think there were some very important people behind that cupboard door. Yeah. And I don't actually like drawing a line between those days and the fraud or autonomy. It showed that Lynch could play fast and loose with the truth, which again is something that all of his former team and employees said, that he would say black was white and white was black, and it was very confusing a lot of the time. But I defy you to find any entrepreneur who doesn't have one of those early stories about how they were trying to make themselves look bigger, make themselves look more credible to try and sell their wares. It's just with Mike Lynch and the autonomy story, it carried on way beyond those early days.
And, in this world of AI, how far ahead of his time was he? I mean, it seemed that the software, the work he was doing you could sell the same message today, it sounds like.
Yes, I think the problem they had was just the computer power wasn't there. And so they had a vision of almost doing what large language models do today. I spoke to one of his tech team quite recently, actually, because I've written an update for the paperback about what the tech did. I think, for us now, talking about search, it's quite hard to remember just how innovative it was at a time when suddenly companies were building up vast stores of information and you needed to access it for marketing or compliance or all of these sorts of things. And one of the problems autonomy had was that although the underlying technology was good, the implementation, which wasn't something they did themselves, was far more complex. And there were lots of examples that I found of people buying the software from Autonomy and then leaving it on the shelf because they couldn't implement it properly. So I think his ideas were far ahead of their time. Some of the structure of the tech around probability, again, is something being used in AI models, but they just didn't have the computer power to make it happen in the way that you're seeing today.
Yeah. And then in terms of, so moving from those kind of early stages into, autonomy proper, how did that go? How did that come about? And because he fairly quickly starts being kind of lauded as the UK tech person. Is that fair?
Yeah, one of them for sure. So, I guess Autonomy and Arm kind of around the same time in Cambridge, but he was, one of the .com stars. So he floated Autonomy 3 times in 1999 and 2000 in Europe and the US and then here in London. And it exploded. And he was running this company from this startup space, the St. John's Innovation Centre in Cambridge, turning over £44 million a year. And it was valued at £4 billion. So kind of absolute classic dot-com business. When he floated it in London, it propelled it, valuation propelled it into the FTSE 100 pretty quickly. And then after the crash, it dropped off. But yes, to your point, as a result of that, and as a result of, I think, doing something very clever with technology, a lot of the analysts I spoke to around the time and people involved in the float, so they didn't quite understand it. Like he was, and at that time he wasn't brilliant at explaining it.
Yeah.
But it certainly wasn't an online retail business. This was like a pure deep tech company, and Britain didn't have very many of them. But after that FTSE 100 listing and then the crash, I put the share price graph in the book because it tells the story far better than I can. You've got this sort of peak and then the crash, and then it sort of struggled really to get back up until almost the sale to Hewlett Packard. And it struggled from some of the points that I made earlier about, the tech was difficult to implement. They weren't investing a massive amount in R&D, which meant that it wasn't keeping up with some of its peers. Some people I spoke to who were involved in the business criticized it because they said it was like a spaghetti web of tech that had just been built on top of. They were acquiring lots of similar businesses to try and build up their portfolio of offering. And then you had the likes of Google who were building something similar, but just a hell of a lot cheaper. So it was a very difficult space to be in for a British business competing against the very deep-pocketed American companies.
Yeah, and that's that's an interesting point in the book as well. And I think you draw it out that he has some regret that he didn't go down into that kind of consumer search space. He stayed within the business space. He thought maybe Autonomy could have been the Google.
Yeah, he always used to say that. And it's sort of difficult to know, like so many of his stories, if that was true or not. He actually put down the fact that he didn't sell to consumers and didn't turn Autonomy software into a Google to what he was being told by Gartner analysts at the time, that it was going to be a hard business model to monetize. They did start on the consumer side when they originally sold Autonomy's software. So perhaps it's not too far a stretch from the truth. But I think to say it could have been Google feels a bit of a leap to me.
Yeah, I do like it wasn't anything I'd seen before. It was Silicon Fen and Silicon Valley. That was a nice touch.
Yeah.
Also on the analysts, you had a really good line that I thought was funny. There was one analyst and you said, they're from the journalistic school that if your mother says she loves you, check it out. I wrote that down. So that's a pretty hard line. Yeah.
Yes. No, they did, and that was one of the Gartner analysts who was a journalist. That's right. Before he and had covered Mike as a journalist before he joined Gartner, and he was one of those who was very critical of Autonomy's technology because if your mother says she loves you, check it out. That's exactly what he was doing with people using the software. He's ringing them up and going, Mike Lynch is telling me this is great. What do you think? Yeah.
So he was getting that other side. Yeah. And then, and these are all kind of relatively standard growing pains, but I guess the problem starts to arise when you're public and you're quarterly reporting and you need to hit those numbers. And I guess that's where it ties back maybe to some of the psychology and the ego and the upbringing and all that stuff we kind of talked about. And things start to happen. And one of them that I wrote down was, they started to use these kind of subcontractors. And there was one bit which you brought out, which obviously stands out, where they sold $11 million of a Vatican contract microlink that didn't exist. So is that kind of when it's starting to tip into this other area?
It's one of the very interesting things about writing this story is just how much information there was around the accounts and what happened because of the forensic investigation done by lawyers and accountants and the aftermath of the fraud. Or perhaps, sorry, I should say the disclosure of the revelations of the fraud, be a better way of putting it. So it's very hard to say this all started around, 2008, 2009, which is where we start getting that wealth of information. Speaking to people at Autonomy, there would always be sort of odd things that were done within the accounts to try and make them look better than they were. And it was very hard for the analysts and people looking at the numbers to exactly unpick what was going on, because they just produced one big revenue figure and they were making lots and lots of acquisitions. So it's quite hard to know what was what. But yes, certainly it does seem that there was this shift around the financial crisis when people were spending far less on software and the market was just getting a lot tighter, when they really started to ramp up manipulation of the figures around the quarterly results. It was unusual as well for a British business to report quarterly, but it feels like maybe a hangover from their time on the NASDAQ and also a way of keeping up with their US peers. But clearly, and this is something that's being debated at the moment in the US, quarterly reporting does push a certain sort of behavior. And there was this enormous pressure within the company coming from Mike Lynch and his CFO, Sushavan Hussain, to hit those figures each quarter. And you described one of the ways that they did it, which was using third parties, registering sales when they weren't there. And often in the most blindingly obvious way when you see it all written out in the timeline, because it would be right at the end of the quarter. This would happen on the 31st of March at midnight, an email would be sent. And there was at least one occasion when they changed the date of an invoice to put it in a different quarter, in a more basic way. But it's always struck me as really sad, actually, because the business was doing fine and they didn't need, it wasn't a sort of Ponzi scheme, not talking about Theranos or something. It was a real company which employed lots of people and sold real products. But at one point they and again, the graphs are all in the book for people who want to sort of geek out on this stuff, and all in the civil court judgment, which is online. They sold, 20% of their revenue was from hardware sales. So they were reselling, Dell mice, keyboards, that sort of thing, and telling them that it was software. So which obviously has a far higher margin. And so it was that sort of dishonesty that was going on. And I mean, maybe, I think you said it in your question, a lot of it maybe is about ego and pride and not wanting to admit that you're not doing as well as you want people to think.
Yeah, and it's kind of one of those things as well. I mean, at that point, he also now has a lot to lose. He's got an OBE, he's got all of this stuff that maybe 6, 7, 8 years before, it wasn't such a blow to the ego, right? It would have been such a problem to say, oh, we're not actually as shiny as we've kind of made ourselves out to be.
A lot of people within the company said to me as well that they believed that it was because he thought he could get away with it. He could be quite arrogant and superior, and he didn't think much of the quality of the analysts in the city. He was very scathing about them. And so when he stood up and delivered his analyst presentation and then answered questions from the analysts, and one of the things I was doing for the book was going through all the transcripts of these calls, he would lie to them and seemed to show no compunction at doing that. And his team said, he just thought he could get away with it because he felt he was cleverer than everybody else.
lies that are obvious that the analysts pick up on?
No, I mean, really quite elaborate ones, but that if you weren't within the company, you probably didn't have a hope in hell of knowing weren't true. So in the quarter where they sold 20% of their revenue was hardware, and they put the costs down as marketing, he told the analysts that they'd created this extraordinary new product that nobody could possibly understand because it was far too complicated, called the structured probabilistic engine, which looked at structured data, so data in databases like spreadsheets, rather than unstructured data, which was what Autonomy's main products did. And so you can, if you're an analyst and you're hearing this from the boss, of course, it's not.
You've nothing else
weird
to go
that you would say that you would think that's true.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the exact phrase he used to the JP Morgan analyst who asked about it, but it was something along the lines of, this is very complicated, very deep technology, hard to get your head around.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't true.
Yeah. That's always a red flag for me when someone says it's too complex for you to me to explain it or for you to understand. And, okay, that's where I'd be like, check it out.
But they tried to. Some of them asked whether they could take part in trials of it, and they were told that there weren't any more spaces. I mean, it was as always with these things, until you can really see under the bonnet of a company, which is why this was such an extraordinary book to write, really, because I had all of these resources. Most of the time, as a journalist, as an analyst, you're kind of flying blind, and you're very much depending on what you're told. It's quite rare that you get access to everything.
The weight of what you're hearing goes up with in normal times, but here you just have it's all there. And so you, from what you heard from others and those, you just think it was almost like a very near term, I'll say this now, but I'm smart enough, I'll get around it and then it'll go away kind of thing.
So his US CEO ended up testifying in all of the trials, actually. And he turned informant for the US government after the DOJ went after Mike Lynch and his CFO, Zushavan Hussain. And one of the things he said in court repeatedly was that the fraud or the fiddling with the numbers, however you want to describe it, created a black hole in every quarter that then felt even more pressure to fill. And when you read the emails coming out of Autonomy at that time, you can feel that pressure and that fear from all of the executives. So it's really fascinating. It was like a pressure cooker, and I felt like that, as the business came towards the sale in 2011 to HP, that the intensity of what was going on to try and hit those numbers just got far more intense and pressurized.
Oh, and going back to what we said earlier, but for Lynch, that's baseline. That's neutral almost. That's normal, being in that kind of atmosphere. But I do think it's interesting, and this is why it's so intriguing. And even when I read it and I came away from it, I still didn't know where I stood. I was like, because there's some elements of hero in what's happening, and then like you also highlight and make, and you do a great job of highlighting that to younger people and those who need guidance, he's almost excessively generous and kind.
Yeah, that came across. Yeah, absolutely, and something that a lot of his friends and acquaintances said. If they were at a lunch party and Lynch was there and a child was there and they were struggling, I don't know, to know what they should do in their A-levels, or someone described a very autistic child to me who struggled to talk to people, and Lynch just took the time to talk to them about their future and to kind of get to understand them in a way that he didn't seem to have that relationship or extend that kindness to all adults. It's not across the board. One person certainly said to me that, Mike Lynch always remembered to thank his PA. So maybe it was a sense of he was often kind or generous or thoughtful towards people who were more vulnerable. But towards his staff members, he could be absolutely brutal. And I also heard stories where he'd pick out, for example, during one PR pitch, he picked out the most junior guy in the room and started firing him with kind of management consultant style questions about how many marbles you could fit in a jumbo jet, and made him feel like a total idiot.
Yeah.
So a very, very complex character. But I'm glad you said that, because it was the line I was trying to tread with the book.
Yeah.
Was not to present a total ogre, A, because I don't think that's fair, but B, because I wanted to make sure that it was balanced and that you understood that this was a very multifaceted, very complicated individual.
Well, I think you land that plane, it's and with his family as well. He's clearly a very family oriented person. And Loudon Hall was almost like in those walls. And I think you say it, that it's a very different person in there than it is out in either the workplace or in the world or in front of analysts, like night and day.
Yeah, this was his home in Suffolk, which he kind of, it was like a sort of country pile in the way that you would expect, but it was filled with his classic cars, an old ride-on train. He was really interested in the animals on the farm that he'd inherited from the previous owners. And he sort of played the part. I mean, your point about dressing in a suit earlier, he did seem to play different roles in different parts of his life. And this was very much, him at home, entertaining friends, relaxed in a way that he certainly wasn't when he was in the boardroom.
And again, that just adds to this complicated story, because I guess, as readers and humans, we want it to be very clear cut and say, oh, he was an ogre, he did bad things, But then actually there's all this other bit, and later on, and we'll touch on it in a bit, is when he gets to court, particularly in the US, this stuff really actually plays for him and gets him probably out of that completely improbable situation, right?
Yeah. And I should say as well, I haven't talked about this a lot, but he was deaf and got more deaf as he got older. And so a lot of the time he was lip reading, and he hated going to any restaurants where there was background music. And as I get older and my hearing gets more rubbish, I completely empathize with that. And I do wonder sometimes if his abruptness was exacerbated by that. I don't think it was the cause at all, because it comes through from his early days, and I have heard horror stories about what it was like interacting with him from very early on. But I think it's another quite impressive thing, right? To keep fighting like that, to run a business like that, and also be dealing with not being able to hear.
Yeah, I mean, that would exacerbate these things. And then the other point, I mean, we won't go into depth on it now, because I just want to talk about the HB kind of period. But also he has a lot of very loyal people, and again, that the kind of level of that loyalty plays to him later on as well. But we'll talk about that in a bit.
I think a lot is it. I would say a sort of a couple of hands of very loyal people. Yeah. He was not. It really struck me, actually, especially as a journalist covering and having covered the business world for a long time, when he was trying to pull a letter together of supporters to stop his extradition in 2019. Very few people put their heads above the parapet. And you can say, well, he'd been accused of fraud, they didn't really want to, but I disagree, actually. I think I know the business well enough that if people really thought he hadn't done it, they would have stuck up for him. And I think he had upset a lot of people on the way up. And so he could not rely on that. And the British business world is pretty small. People know each other pretty well. And particularly for someone who'd been a FTSE 100 boss, to not be able really to pull that many people together, I think is quite striking. Yeah.
And then I just want to quickly touch on that and back to his his character. You can't help his character of this intellectual and battling and sparring, and I think you bring out the point that during that extradition period he goes and he's talking to Tony Blair, he ends up sparring with him. And you're thinking, oh, what are you doing? You know, but again, it's just nature. He can't stop it. He doesn't know any other approach. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And I think also we shouldn't underestimate what an absolutely hellish time that was. I mean, his character aside, and, you know, he was a difficult personality for sure. But what really struck me about this book is that the only winners in it are the lawyers who worked for HP and for Lynch from 2012 right up until today. Yeah, because the civil court case is still not over. In terms of, and we can talk about that in terms of the financial settlement and things. So, you know, I don't know whether you've ever been involved in a big court case. I'm lucky enough to say that I haven't, but this is very Dickensian, Jarndyce and Jarndyce sort of just interminable, really bitter battle between two sides. And for Lynch, it was existential. For in the London case, you're talking about his finances being wiped out, but also his reputation being ripped to shreds. And this is a man who is exceptionally proud and who had worked up from a very poor background to these extraordinary heights. And then the extradition he was fighting was his freedom. You know, he was facing life in prison. But yes, perhaps another person might have calmed their temper to talk to Tony Blair when they were trying to campaign not to be sent to the US. But as you say, he couldn't help himself. But I think the pressure at that time must have been absolutely immense. And most people in those cases settle. Yeah. Most people, it was really very rare for a corporate case like this to go to trial.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's another sign, isn't it, of the person involved. But yeah.